Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Education. It is February 17th, 2:35. Let me just give everyone, do a little housekeeping first. Committee chairs met just last evening, and the date for crossover is still in the works. It's not yet been set, but it will either be March 12th or the 19th. And I think the pro tem is assessing when it looks like, we may wrap up, et cetera. So those who are starting to just think about, end of session kinds of things and timing, I would recommend people check in with the pro tem's office. But either way, it gives us about another few weeks, 2 weeks exactly, with town meeting week being a week away, to get any bills out before crossover. The pro tem has asked each chair to provide a list of likely bills that will be finished before crossover. Whether or not they're on the floor before we go is another thing. Some may end up in money committees. For new senators, just note money committees are given an extra week before bills have to leave their committees. So if we have, for example, a March 12th crossover date for policy committees, finance and appropriations, and I believe institutions also would be included in that, would have a March 19th date to make crossover. And so what I have reported to the pro tem's office is I mentioned that we will likely have a school discipline bill, school discipline advisory council bill. We will likely have a literacy committee bill. We will have our letter to appropriations outlining these expedited finances voted out likely, hopefully on Friday. And then we'll also have a miscellaneous education bill that will probably will incorporate what the agency is hoping, the administration is hoping that we'll consider today, as well as I would think that that's where we will put our library work, our cultural liaison work, and our act relating to school wellness and feminine hygiene work. If people are looking for something else, or if they're looking for a different path for a piece of legislation, please let me know, and we will accommodate as best we can. The bill that we're taking up today, S75, depending on committee's positions, could be either, may also be something we push to get over the crossover line. It may be something that we attach to our other literacy work, or it may be something that we attach to something that is coming our way from the House, or it's something that we would look at getting out next winter. After we take up S75, we'll look at the miscellaneous ed bill suggestions from the Agency of Education, and then we will return to our work on COVID-19 education related needs, and that in short order will be the work for the day. And as for COVID-19 educational needs, this is returned to our appropriations request that Jim has been working on and that we've all been working on, and appropriations would like us to sign on the dotted line, hopefully by the end of this week. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Senator Terenzini. Senator Terenzini introduced S75, an act relating to screening students for dyslexia. Senator Terenzini, if you would be so kind as to just give us, why you put the bill in, a little bit about what it does, and then we'll turn it over to Ledge Council for a more formal walkthrough.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Campion. I appreciate it. Really, this idea was, I believe, brought to all of us in the committee, and I took the lead on it from one of our witnesses, Doreen Dorfman, who I see there in the center of my screen. And it really perked my interest from the information that Doreen had sent over. It was something that I almost would have just assumed that we had in place already to screen for the markers of dyslexia, and yet to learn that there's so many other states that do it, and Vermont wasn't one of them. So I was compelled to attach my name to this and and work with Jim and you, Senator Campion, to get this bill put together in short order. And I'm glad to see that Doreen is here as one of our witnesses, because I look forward to hearing what she has to provide. And of course, I look forward to hearing the good work of Jim Demarais. So that's pretty much the introduction, Senator Campion, and
Great.
I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful. We have all been contacted, and I appreciate Senator Terenzini's leadership on this. I would mention before Mr. Demarais takes us through for our witnesses, something to think about is, already this bill in some ways has come up. And by that, I mean, when we've talked about literacy, there have been, some of our witnesses have talked about why moving in this direction isn't a good idea. A feeling of attaching, a stigma to a student all the way through their academic career, starting at such a young age. And then I've also heard from constituents who have felt as though their children have had to do catch up because they didn't have this sort of testing, early on. So something for you all to be thinking about as our Leg Council takes us through the bill. With that, Jim, always a pleasure. Glad you're here.
Glad to be here. So does everyone have access to the bill, or should I try to bring it up?
I believe we all have access to the bill, and not unless I see someone who would like to see it up, we will go ahead and follow along on our iPads and computers.
Okay.
Thanks.
So for the record, Jim Demarais, Leg Council, we're walking through S75, which is an act relating to screening students for dyslexia. The bill starts with, it's adding a new chapter to Title 16, and that is entitled Dyslexia Screening. And there are a few definitions to begin with. The first is of dyslexia itself, which means a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. That typically results from a deficit in the phonological component of language, and that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And then there's a definition of evidence-based methods of instruction, which, as we'll come on to, is used for students who have been identified as having dyslexia. So this method of instruction consists of specialized reading, writing, and spelling instruction that is multisensory in nature, equipping students to simultaneously use multiple senses including vision, hearing, touch, and movement. Evidence-based methods of instruction employ direct instruction of systematic and cumulative objectives, with the sequence beginning with the student's easiest and most basic elements and progressing methodically to more difficult material, as indicated by systematic progress monitoring. Each step is built on those steps previously learned. Components of evidence-based methods of instruction include instruction targeting phonological awareness, sound symbol association, syllable structure, morphology, syntax, and semantics. Okay, so now we're moving on to subsection B, line 14, which is the early screening for markers of dyslexia. And it says, students enrolled in public schools in Vermont shall be screened for markers of dyslexia first during the fall semester of kindergarten and first grade, and during the spring semester of kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, if a student does not meet the expected literacy standards for those grades. And then it goes on, section 2 says, in addition, a student at any grade level, K through 12, shall be screened for markers of dyslexia upon the request of the student's parent, guardian, teacher, counselor, or school psychologist to determine if the student would benefit from intervention within the school's multi-tier systems of support. And then C goes on to what happens when students are identified with markers of dyslexia. And it says if a student is identified as having these markers, the school shall notify the school's parent or guardian, provide the student's parent or guardian with information and resource material about dyslexia, provide the student with appropriate evidence-based methods of instruction, which brings us back to the definition we went through at the beginning. 4, monitor and, subject to state and federal privacy laws, report the student's progress to the parent or guardian and all involved parties. And D is notification requirement, which requires public schools at the beginning of each school year to notify all parents or guardians of enrolled students or if relevant to grades offered by the school, the required screenings and the screenings that may be requested under subsection B. So those are the screenings for both students in the early years, and then at request of older students. So they have to be informed about that. And the school's duties to address dyslexia, which is how they would address dyslexia if identified under subsection C. And then that notification may be included with other information provided by the school to parents or guardians and students at the beginning of the school year. And the act shall take effect on July 1 of this year.
Thank you. Committee, any questions before we move to our witnesses? Dr. Dorfman, you are on my schedule first. Does that work for you? Great. And so what I'd like to do is give, it looks like we have 3 witnesses on this issue. I don't see Ms. Lovejoy here yet, but if you could plan your testimony for about 15 minutes each, including time for a couple of questions. And Dr. Dorfman, if I may, in your kickoff, if you will, tell us what dyslexia is.
Sure. I'll just start by saying that Brittany Lovejoy couldn't join us because of a family emergency. So Brenda and I are here instead. Brittany would like to attend in the future to provide testimony. But to get to your question, I'll just speak off the top of my head. The International Dyslexia Association has a widely accepted definition of dyslexia, but it is a condition that is neurobiological in origin, and there is no cure. Between 5 to 17% of students have can be diagnosed with dyslexia, and it is characterized by difficulty with language from early needs that would be observed by a speech language pathologist with phonological and phonemic problems, through reading and reading comprehension, spelling, vocabulary development, reading fluency, and since there is no cure, but instead the student requires extensive instruction over their years of schooling, that as the literacy expectations increase, text gets longer and more complex, they need corresponding instruction alongside. So, but I'll get into that a little bit more as well, Brenda, when we present. Is that helpful?
It is.
Okay. All right. Shall I begin with what I had prepared?
Please. Why don't you introduce yourself and for the record and take it away.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Doreen Dorfman. I live in Waterbury Center. Thank you, Senators, for inviting us today about S75, an act relating to screening students for dyslexia.
I'm sorry, Dr. Dorfman, if I may, you're a school administrator where?
I'm actually coming as a private citizen.
Okay.
So I've worked in a number of schools over the last 25 years.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you.
Okay. I would like to explain the importance of this bill and its positive impact on students learning to read well. As I said, this is my 25th year working in schools in Vermont as a teacher and administrator. Over this time, I served many children and teens who could hardly read. This was not obvious at first. The students were insightful and eloquent, but when asked to read aloud or explain what they had read, they could not. Sometimes they'd start crying. Other times they admitted, "I don't understand what I read." This drove me to dive deep into reading research and enroll in the Reading Institute at Bay Path University and pursue the education specialist degree in reading and literacy instruction, despite having already completed a doctorate in education at UVM and a Fulbright scholarship. S75 is extremely important for Vermont's students and schools. Screening for the markers of dyslexia using evidence-based tools, such as those recommended in the 4 Pillars of Reading Success, an action guide for states, published last June by the National Council on Teacher Quality, will not only identify and benefit students with dyslexia, but also students who are below proficient and who need effective instruction. As stated in S75, these markers include phonological deficits, including difficulty with recognizing and manipulating speech sounds, retrieving words, and rhyming. Markers of dyslexia also include difficulties with reading and spelling words. From first grade through high school, screening also targets reading comprehension, vocabulary knowledge, and fluency. S75 stipulates evidence-based methods that consist of specialized reading, writing, and spelling instruction that is multisensory. Evidence-based is the gold standard of research, in which independent experts conduct rigorous, objective, and scientific review to verify the research methods and outcomes. Students with the markers of dyslexia will receive direct and systematic instruction that is cumulative, so they practice their increasing knowledge and skills over time to attain grade level literacy. S75 rightly articulates that each step is built on those previously learned. On this foundation, students with the markers of dyslexia will receive appropriate education before or if they fall behind. S75 lists the key evidence-based methods of instruction. These include phonological awareness is the metacognitive awareness of the speech sound system, fundamental for literacy. Students distinguish subtle sound differences like short I and short E, and eh, and become agile in phoneme manipulation, such as being able to say pit to pet to bet to bat to mat to mush. Students learn to recognize and create their own rhymes, nickel, pickle, tickle, and alliteration, 3, throw, through. For some students, this comes absolutely automatically. Other students need the evidence-based instruction described in S75 to achieve this early level of automaticity and master the 44 speech sounds produced by the 26 letters of our alphabet. Number 2, sound symbol association. 50% of the English language is spelled by direct sound symbol correspondence, and another 36% can be spelled accurately except for one speech sound, usually a vowel, such as the word said, in which AI is irregular. Students with markers of dyslexia especially struggle with spelling. Here, S75 will make a substantial improvement in their learning. Number 3, syllable structure. Our English language of over 600,000 words have only 6 syllable types. When poor readers are directly taught to recognize each type, such as the silent E syllable, like dome and fame, and the consonant LE syllable, steeple, uncle, they gain a very powerful strategy for reading and spelling words correctly. Morphology. When students learn morphemes, which are the smallest units of meaning in words, their vocabulary and comprehension grows exponentially. Students with the markers of dyslexia need the direct instruction in which they learn that, for example, the prefix con in consensus means with, The root struct in construct means build. The suffix shun in nation means the act or condition of. With direct instruction in morphology, including our Anglo-Saxon bases, Latin roots, and Greek forms, students dramatically increase their vocabulary and thereby improve their comprehension. They also learn to create word webs and experience how words move from noun to verb to adjective and to adverb, such as dog to dog, dogged, and doggedly. Syntax. Syntax is the rule system of sentence structure. Knowing vocabulary is not enough. Poor understanding and use of syntax is another marker of dyslexia. Syntax improves reading comprehension and writing, especially moving up through the grades when text becomes more complex. Number 6, and lastly, semantics. Semantics is the meaning of words within a context. For example, bat the ball is very different in meaning than the actor batted her eyelashes. Semantic instruction is essential to educate students with the markers of dyslexia. This includes vocabulary, inferencing, and making meaning of text. Another benefit of S75 is early screening and instruction. Students' brains absorb the foundations of English from kindergarten to second grade like no other time. You've probably heard how natural and easy it is for children this age to pick up other languages. After a short time immersed in another country, they can chat up a storm. The same phenomenon happens in our English language. For students without dyslexia markers, the brain only needs 1 to 4 exposures to learn new and spell new words. But struggling students may need 12 to 20 instructional exposures to achieve the same learning. Like evidence-based instruction, screening and assessments must be scientifically validated and reliable. This means other evidence-based assessments arrive at the same results. An unreliable screener only measures progress in a reading program with results that do not correspond with external measures. In contrast, in my graduate program at the Reading Institute, I assessed students with the Letters Reading and Spelling Screener and the Gallistel-Ellis Reading and Spelling Screener. The results were identical, and I, as their teacher, found what the students already knew and what I needed to teach. In grades K through 2, we want to ensure that the structure of English becomes accurately mapped in their brains. When you can automatically say, read, write, and spell a word, then the word has been permanently mapped. You will never forget the word. Upon sight, you cannot unsee the word. With ease, you can include the word while writing. Your eyes are the conduit for the 4 parts of the brain developed to form robust neural connections, working in microseconds to access the meaning stored. It's why your brain instantly knows the difference between receive and receipt. This recognition is automatic, unconscious, and actually delightful. All students deserve instruction to master the skills that all literate adults take for granted and use every day. Language learned is neurologically mapped to the brain, as I have said, but including errors. It can take weeks to months of intensive remediation to correct these errors. This is expensive and time-consuming and may require students, particularly older students, to miss other school activities. But the research is clear. Accommodations and modifications are never a substitute for remediation. Students with severe reading deficits may need up to 2 hours of daily reading instruction, prioritized over other subjects, because reading is the fundamental skill upon which all formal education depends. When students are provided structured literacy instruction, over time, S75 will greatly reduce the need for remediation and also reduce the need for special education services. S75 will lead schools to identify students who have not made grade level progress on the components of language instruction. For students who come to school with limited vocabulary and background knowledge, this instruction is the difference between success and failure at school. Many children from low-income families, children of color, and ELL students, English language students, depend on this direct instruction to master standard English. S75 will also identify often overlooked dyslexic students, those who have strong oral language skills, who compensate in the lower grades, but then struggle to read in 3rd or 4th grade when the amount and complexity of text increase. S75 screens all children in the fall of kindergarten, 1st grade, catching them before they fail. Any student in the spring of grades K through 3 who doesn't meet grade level literacy standards will be assessed again and provided the evidence-based instruction needed to advance learning during class and through interventions. S75 also provides screening for all students K through 12 who exhibit the markers of dyslexia. Think of all the middle and high school students who struggle now due to limited vocabulary and poor spelling, poor fluency, and poor comprehension. S75 opens the door to evidence-based instruction they need to progress in literacy and be best prepared to join Vermont's workforce, especially in much needed areas that require strong literacy skills, such as in healthcare and technology. We know the detrimental lifelong consequences of low literacy on individuals, on their families, on our state and our country. S75 can give our students what they need now. The bill stipulates that schools send annual notification about K3 screenings and the opportunities for parents and others to request a screening in any grade. Schools also notify parents when their children are in need of evidence-based instruction and interventions. Schools will provide information and resources about the markers of dyslexia. In this way, they can partner together to advance students' literacy levels. In K2, parents and schools can make the most of these critical years of language development. In all grades, parents can learn about the evidence-based methods their children will receive. In closing, by leading and supporting the passage of S75, many more students will learn to read who otherwise would have been missed from the foundational years through high school. Research shows that 95% of students learn to read when provided evidence-based instruction. Ultimately, S75 will result in enormous cost savings, reduce the number of students in special education, increase our high school and college graduation rates, and equip Vermont youth with the 21st century literacy skills needed for success. Over the course of the coronavirus pandemic and reduced access to educational programs, the time for S75 has never been greater. The bill will make huge inroads in teaching all students to read proficiently. Thank you so much for your support of our students and our schools.
Thank you, Dr. Dorfman. It was great testimony, and thanks for your commitment. We are also as a committee working separately, you may know, on a literacy bill, and the state is planning on making a big investment in getting our teachers, our general sort of pre-K through 3rd grade teachers, trained in teaching reading and writing, and we certainly recognize the need. If I may, what's the downside to this bill? I mean, what is it? Why are we hearing some of the opposition we are hearing? What do you think is the downside?
I wouldn't call it a downside, but
okay.
I think there is concern for a couple of reasons. One concern is that it will require teachers to change instructional practices.
Okay.
That requires significant training, as you just mentioned. And there has been controversy in the past over the best methods to use for teaching literacy, particularly to cultivate a love of learning and love of books. And in my experience, and from everything I've read, and also as a principal supervising teachers teaching reading, students love to be able to learn how to read.
Mm-hmm.
And they make those connections. It's so much more when they can have the realization for themselves of the depth of the storyline or the facts that they're learning from the text, rather than having the teacher explain it to them, which is much harder to remember, in fact. And so that is, I think, a concern that is voiced. Another concern that I've heard is that, including from Diane Ravitch, who says that schools are not the problem, poverty is the problem. And I would like to reflect to you that my father was completely dependent on the school system to provide the education he needed to go on to college and graduate school and be able to provide for his family. His father was barely literate. His parents did not speak much English. They were literally off the boat, coming from many generations of poverty, and completely entrusting the school system in the 30s to provide everything he needed so he could succeed in America that they could not provide for him either here or back in Europe. And so when I hear an attitude that children are too poor to learn, there are additional needs when students have limited oral language spoken at home, when perhaps their first language, if it's other than English, is not strong, and then they learn what they call the L2 language, which would be the adopted English language, when the first one is weak. But the type of instruction, this evidence-based instruction, is the same. Some students need it 1 to 4 times. That's a student who doesn't have dyslexia, as I mentioned. But other students need it 12 to 20 times in order to learn the same level. But this type of multisensory evidence-based instruction, there's a lot of differentiation of methods, but the methods are based on evidence that work. So, and there's a lot of research, and I'd be happy to share even more about that, but I know Brenda can too.
Committee, questions for Dr. Dorfman. Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dorfman. My question is about the screening. So what does that kind of look like when if we were to require all these children to be screened? I'm assuming, you're not doing like a standardized test. So is it just like, is that part of the training that each teacher would have to be trained how to do this screening? And it's just a different assessment tool for each teacher in those grades to figure out where each child is?
So yes, teachers would need to have training. They don't necessarily have to screen their own students. Sometimes it's helpful to have a colleague or the literacy specialist or interventionist or special educator to conduct the screening. It's very, very important that the screener is conducted with fidelity. I have seen too many examples of when they have not been. Perhaps not using an evidence-based tool. For example, the evidence-based tool needs to be externally validated. DIBELS is a very good assessment, and assessments vary based on the needs. So with a high school student, if there are difficulties, you might need to use what's called the gray oral reading test, which is about fluency and comprehension. And that is a very there's a range. But I referred to this very important publication called The 4 Pillars of Reading Success, an action guide for states. And it specifically lists assessment tools to use that are excellent evidence-based screeners. It also lists tools not to use that are commercially available, widely marketed, and will not provide valid measures of what students can and can't do. But Senator Perchik, I cannot tell you how incredible it is to see the same results and then to teach children, because they have to do an Orton-Gillingham practicum, and know exactly going into it what they know and what they don't know. And when I teach them what they don't know, their faces light up. One said to me when he learned when a Y becomes an I, like a word like happiness, and he said, no one has ever taught me this before. He's 12. And that's just one. But he knew that I knew he didn't know. So I knew exactly what to teach. And that can be true of every teacher. And I've seen it taught here in Vermont in some schools.
First follow-up, is the Orton-Gillingham, is that what the Stern Center specializes in as well? Do you know?
Yes. Yes, they use a number of programs, but the Orton Gillingham is an approach. There are programs that you can use that support Orton Gillingham, but Orton Gillingham is a very broad approach.
Okay.
Not very broad in that it's a big tent. It's that a teacher is required to have I have to do a full year training, 8-credit graduate course in order to teach it, get a level of certification for it. But Brenda can talk about that too.
One last question, and maybe Brenda can answer it as well, is one criticism I heard is that other educators worried of marking a child with dyslexia. You called it markers of dyslexia. In your requirement, you have to notify the parent, and that they were worried that at a very young age that this assessment might put the marker that this child has dyslexia when they don't have dyslexia or might not have dyslexia, but that's going to be a deficit for that child for the rest of their lives. What's your reaction to that?
I've personally never experienced that as a negative consequence. I can give you multiple examples, but I will leave kind of the personal on the side because there are people with dyslexia in my family, and boy, would they have liked to have known. And I, as a mother, would like to have known, so I could have provided the instruction that my child needed, particularly in that K2 time where they can learn so fast, 1 to 4 times or okay, maybe double that, but not 25 times or 30 times when they're 18 years old and they can't get a decent score on the SAT and they don't get accommodations on a test where they really need it. So that's one thing I would like to say. But another is, who is dyslexic? We were very intentional about choosing the term markers of dyslexia rather than a dyslexic child, because the markers are a range, and you don't necessarily check off every box, but we can agree that all students who have reading difficulties are entitled to evidence-based instruction that will address the difficulties and turn them into strengths on grade level and above. So it's less, so you don't have to say to a student, oh, you're a dyslexic, or to a parent, but the markers of dyslexia, and this is what we're doing, and perhaps this is what you could do at home. Not that they're doing the job of teaching, but there's reinforcement activities that can be done at home. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Other questions? Senator Hooker, please.
Yeah, thank you. And it sort of follows, I think, along what Senator Perchlik was talking about. I think one of the things that we heard was that all kids need to sort of be screened for reading abilities. And so I'm wondering what the screening for dyslexia markers, how it's different from other screening, or is it something that, a screening for reading deficits would show, and then, you carry on from there as far as channeling kids into the types of remediation or support that they need.
Brenda, I'm going to let you take this one since you've done it much more than I have. I'm still a student.
Right. Any other immediate questions for Dr. Dorfman before we shift? Ms. Peters. Okay, great. Ms. Peters, thanks for joining us. It looks like you're over in New Hampshire.
I am.
We welcome our neighbors to the east.
Excellent. Thank you.
Everything you hear about Vermonters is true. Warm and friendly.
Well, that's awesome.
So it's great to have you here. If you want to jump right in and answer that question and then introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So what you probably will want to look at, and that this bill, I think this act proposes, is a universal screener for all children. And then that percent of children who are at risk you'll be able to tell who they are. And those are the children you can start to design programming for. And based on some of those measures, you may want to do some additional probes. But the probes aren't necessarily standardized testing. They're things that the teacher can do to guide her instruction, his or her instruction. So generally, you're going to start with a general reading screener, and they have them from preschool all the way up to, to high school. And you would do those. We typically do them 3 times a year in most school systems, but your screener you would do at the beginning of the year and then later if it were warranted.
Okay. And can I ask another question, please?
Sure.
And I guess this goes back to Dr. Dorfman. You said greatly reduce the need for remediation over time. And I guess either of you could answer this. Is there data that you can show us that other states that have provided the type of screening that you're talking about will be able to let us know exactly, how long, or exactly, I'm sure it's student specific, but what's the general timeline that you've seen remediation, sort of fading off or not being quite as necessary? How long does it take? And I'm specifically thinking about if you start in kindergarten.
Right. If you start in kindergarten and you have a great program in place, so you're using structured literacy with all the students because they all benefit from it, and you're doing great programming like phonemic awareness and developing, because we know those are key skills that children need to have, and you're doing that in kindergarten, first, second, third, you may be able to almost eliminate the number of students who are referred to special education. We do know that those children who don't get those services and who are at risk, by the time they get to 3rd grade, it will take 4 times longer for them to get the remediation that they need. So it takes longer and it becomes more costly.
Thank you.
Senator Lyons, please.
Thank you. And thank you for all the information. I just am asking if there's any history of any screening for dyslexia in our state and any services that may have been provided either by individual district or more broadly. Because I do know there are a lot of kids who have been identified as dyslexic, but has that been part of a screening program? And are there services that have been in place in specific areas of the state?
I can mention 2 schools I'm aware of. In the town of Williamstown, in Williamstown Elementary School, they have screeners in place. All of the teachers have been trained through the Stern Center in Orton Gillingham. And so regular screening and progress monitoring and providing evidence-based literacy instruction is what they do. And I don't know if you are aware, but after this meeting, I can email you the data, which I have tracked closely in Williamstown because I once worked there and lived not too far away, and have just been amazed by them having gone from the 3rd lowest performing elementary school in the state to really very high percentages of that. It's parents sending their child to school there can feel very confident that their child will learn how to read.
Dr. Dorfman, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to stay on this for one moment. So we've heard this before about Williamstown, and you're saying
and Randolph.
Randolph, because again, we are hopefully going to make a very large investment in, again, getting teachers trained to teach reading. And you're telling us again that Williamstown did this through the Stern Center, and over a period of time, indeed, saw an increase in literacy rates. The number that we keep sort of focusing on, whether accurate, whether it's the right age group or not, is 3rd grade.
Mhm.
And would you mind sharing any data you have on that with our committee assistant, Jeannie Lowell? That would be great, and she'll share it with us.
The other school that I don't want to be forgotten is the Brattleboro School District, because
Okay.
their
Oh.
reading coach he is responsible for training all of their elementary teachers K-6, and he was one of my professors at the Reading Institute. And when I showed him the scores of a student I'm working with, he said, we don't have anything that looks like this in our district except for a very disabled student who's eligible for special education, but no gen ed students have these problems. They all know these spelling patterns. They all can read these nonsense words because they all know their syllable types.
Thank you.
So
Sorry.
can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, and I'm sorry
Yeah.
to have interrupted.
No, you're fine. Because I was going there to Williamstown and Randolph. But so given that it was a Stern Center that worked with these folks, and we heard from them about in our literacy conversation, are we, I don't like killing birds, but are we killing two birds with one stone if we put in place a literacy program such as the one that was in place in Williamstown and in Randolph?
I don't understand when you say, well, we're killing two birds with one stone.
Dyslexia and then improving our literacy scores overall. So it's not just dyslexic children who improved in Williamstown, although it sounds like they did radically improve. So I'm treating the literacy side for those kids differently from the dyslexic children. But if we have a comprehensive literacy program in place, then does that solve the problem that you're talking about?
So it's essential that there are screening tools, that there are evidence-based assessments in place. So think of it as there's the screening and the assessment, there's the structured literacy instruction, and evidence-based, and then the teacher training. If you're talking about putting all those three things together, it's heaven on earth.
That's exactly what I was talking about. So thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Senator Lyons. Other questions for either Ms. Peters or Dr. Dorfman? Ms. Peters, anything else? I mean, that you want to convey to the committee? And I guess one question that I might have or do have is, was there a before and after in New Hampshire when this happened? In other words, was New Hampshire a state that there wasn't screening for dyslexia, and then what happened? When did this?
And now there is. And now there is.
Witness.
Right, and I'll talk about this in my talk, but we did see a number of effects. This came into place in 2016 in New Hampshire. It's an act similar to this act that requires screening for children in K and 1. And they also contracted someone at the state, a reading specialist, who put together modules for teachers on understanding what is dyslexia, which helped in understanding that. And they also, it provided a mechanism for parents to get support for their children when needed. And it also provided an ineptus or a move for more teachers to become trained in structured literacy. We've seen an uptick in interest in teachers as they see that it can be effectively implemented with all students with great results. So, yeah. COVID, though, has been very hard.
Sure. As you're reviewing files and things, and even you may even have them at your fingertips, any data that you might that you think is relevant to this conversation that would help us in our decision-making process, please feel free to send it along to Jeannie Lowell, our committee assistant, and she'll get it to us.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Dr. Dorfman.
Brenda Peters also prepared to present to talk about the initiative underway in New Hampshire. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, shall I start?
Please.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, Senators. My name is Brenda Peters, and I am the president of the New Hampshire International Dyslexia Association, serving Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, all three. Since its inception 18 years ago, our 15-member volunteer board has worked tirelessly to ensure all children have access to evidence-based instructional methods, referred to here as structured literacy, thereby improving lifespan outcomes. We know that poor reading correlates with low educational attainment, mental health difficulties, unemployment, underemployment, unstable housing, intergenerational transmission of low reading, exposure to violence, and even reduced life expectancy. By teaching all students to read, reading failure is prevented and poor life outcomes are avoided. I would like to share another important discovery. In my career as a reading teacher and trainer, I have found no greater motivation for a child to learn than learning to read. And likewise, I have also found no greater motivation for teachers than seeing their children become readers. As an organization, NHIDA supports S75, an act relating to the screening for dyslexia. It is an important imperative step in identifying children in grades kindergarten through 3 who are at risk for markers of dyslexia and meeting their needs before it's too late. We know that with early intervention, evidence-based instruction, and delivery with fidelity, nearly all children will successfully learn to read. The best solution to the problem of reading failure is to allocate resources for early identification and prevention, which this act seeks to do. From the 1920s to 1948, neuropsychiatrist and pathologist Samuel Orton pioneered the study of reading failure and related language-based difficulties. Dr. Orton correctly posited that dyslexia was due to a brain-based difference, not related to intelligence. Together with psychologist and teacher Anna Gillingham, they developed a structured, systematic, multisensory approach for teaching reading referred to as the Orton-Gillingham approach, known today as structured literacy, a form of evidence-based instruction. Reading researcher June Leday Orton formed the Orton Society, which today is known as the International Dyslexia Association, the oldest organization dedicated to the study of reading and structured literacy. In 2012, in collaboration with the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the National Institute for Health and Human Development, the IDA led the way in defining dyslexia as dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading, comprehension, and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. This IDA definition of dyslexia is often cited in legislation throughout the United States and is quoted here in S75. As stated, dyslexia is neurobiological in origin and impacts up to 20% of the population. We know, however, only 13 to 14% of students qualify for special education services nationally. And of those that qualify, only half have been identified with specific learning disabilities. And 85% of these children are poor readers. This means that many kids who have dyslexia are not being identified. The 2019 National Assessment of Educational Progress Report found that more than 60% of 4th and 8th grade students in the country, including Vermont, were not proficient at reading. Not only did the majority fail to read proficiently, NAEP found that 32% of 4th graders and 23% of 8th graders in Vermont received the lowest scores of below basic. I personally discovered IDA 16 years ago when my own son was finally diagnosed with dyslexia in the 3rd grade. The series of IDA fact sheets became an invaluable resource for me as I navigated how to get my son the instruction he needed. Since Brandon was in preschool, I knew his learning was different, but it took until 3rd grade to learn his diagnosis of dyslexia. That summer, my son attended Tufts University reading program, RAVO. We drove an hour a day each way, 5 days a week, so he could get the needed instruction. He made great gains in reading and in his self-confidence. I spent 3 hours each day reading in the library. I think I was among one of the first to read Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, and the first chapter hooked me. I was struck by how hard it was to get a diagnosis of dyslexia. It took us 3 years, and how fortunate I was to be able to support my son. I had an advanced degree in organizational behavior and development and had worked for a leading company in management development and resource productivity prior to becoming a stay-at-home mom with my 3 children. And still, it took our family until 3rd grade to get a diagnosis. What about other families without the educational and financial wherewithal I had? What becomes of them, I wondered. I knew that getting a diagnosis and treatment shouldn't be this hard. So I became a mom on a mission that summer, a mission that has become my life's work. I became a reading specialist to help my son and others read. Unfortunately, however, what I learned in college did not prepare me to teach struggling readers. So I studied learning disabilities and learned how to write individual education plans and modifications and accommodations, but still, I did not know how to teach my son to read. I discovered the Children's Dyslexia Centers, sponsored by the 32nd degree Masons, less than a mile from the university I was attending. For 25 years, the CDC has provided free one-on-one tutoring to children in grades 1 through 12 twice a week for 2 to 3 years using structured literacy in their 43 centers in the Northeast. In addition, they train and certify dyslexia practitioners in their 14-month training and practicum at no charge. In 2010, the CDC actually had a center in Burlington, Vermont, which has closed for financial reasons. While getting my structured literacy certifications at the center in Nashua, I had the privilege of working 10 years as a case manager providing evidence-based reading instruction in public schools. I also became a specialist in the assessment of dyslexia. Then 7 years ago, I became the director of the CDC Seacoast Learning Center in Rochester, New Hampshire, now in its 17th year. For the past 6 years, our center has provided our dyslexia certification training and practicum to area schools. In the Rochester School District alone, which has 4,200 students, we have trained and certified 45 dyslexia practitioners, including administrators, reading specialists, case managers, English teachers, and educational technicians, with significant impact on student and teacher outcomes. We know that struggling readers who participate in a year of one-on-one tutoring twice a week often achieve grade level proficiency. We also see improvement on evidence-based screeners like the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, or DIBELS. In 2016, NHIDA supported and helped pass the New Hampshire House Bill 1644, a very similar act requiring dyslexia screening with evidence-based instruction when needed. Overall, the act has increased dyslexia awareness in the state. We now have a dyslexia handbook for teachers and parents. The New Hampshire Department of Education contracts with a reading specialist who created training modules for teachers on the markers of dyslexia. There has been an increased demand for structured literacy instruction from parents. And finally, parents of children with markers of dyslexia have the support of the Act to back them in getting their children needed services. IDA defines structured literacy as an
Ms.
approach
Peters,
that includes—
I'm sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. I'm going to have to ask you to try to conclude soon. We just
Okay.
have some witnesses in the waiting room and we're running a little late.
Absolutely.
We can always have you back. Thank you.
Absolutely. So structured literacy includes two things: content and methods. And you have that in my piece. What's most important about the content is that, and I'll just go off topic now and you can read what I have. What's most important is we believe that the people in the training need to have direct experience and have to have a guided, coached practicum. It's one thing to teach them the classroom material and the background information they need, but it's critical for them to have a practicum where they can learn these practices and become skilled technicians, because it really takes a great deal of practice and knowledge. So if you can build that system within your schools, it will be a very powerful tool. These are comments from different teachers who have gone through the training and how it impacted their life. Most times teachers who get this training, it is life-changing, because sometimes, often for the first time in their life, they know how and are confident in teaching children to read. And then for children, there is no greater motivator for a child than learning that they can learn to read. This is, and I see this all the time. It is so empowering when children finally get a method that works and they start to read. It's a powerful tool, a powerful experience. So thank you for letting me share.
Committee, questions? You both have been incredibly helpful to us and hope you'll stay in touch as we make our way through this work. And I think we will leave it there. We do hope to hear from Williamstown Elementary School, possibly tomorrow, and any other data or information you believe is critical to our crafting of this bill. Please forward it along to Ms. Lowell. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, you too. Committee, why don't we just take a 5-minute stretch before we jump in? Committee, it looks like we're back live. I'm pretty excited about literacy. I really do think we're going to be making some steps here, and we're going to hear more tomorrow around what kind of dollars people really think we should be spending. And it sounds like it's a lot more than what we've marked already in the appropriations letter. But I am optimistic that we'll look back and hopefully we'll feel like we made a difference. So before we change topics and shift to miscellaneous education, while we do have Mr. Fisher here and Ms. Simmons, would you both, or I think it's really for you, Mr. Fisher, tell us how many people in the agency work on literacy? You're muted. There you go.
So if you're, let me ask a clarifying question, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair. Firstly, for the record, Ted Fisher from the Vermont Agency of Education. I'm our Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. So are you looking for someone with expertise in literacy? Because one of the things that we've identified as an issue statewide is that there's actually a relative paucity. This is something that the House Education has taken up both this biennium and the last. We have a few folks at the higher education level. So we don't have anyone with sort of that formal training. We have a team, the proficiency-based learning team, which has literacy and reading and as part of their brief, as it were, in terms of the educational performance. We also have folks who have expertise in the assessment and data side of things. So, and that really is in part our role, in terms of understanding the performance of the field and making sure that we're providing the technical assistance. We do have the capacity to, for example, contract out or seek out outside expertise as part of that. But we ourselves do not have a literacy specialist or someone with that skill and training.
Okay.
And that's a weak point that we've identified statewide.
Sure. So we do have a literacy bill. I know you've worked on it with us. As you know, you've been in to talk about it. We've made some changes. One of those changes is, as you'll see, is really beefing up the agency if need be, and that's what prompted the question. And I didn't mean to in any way to put you on the spot in that regard. It's just something that has been floating around out there. And while we have you, I just thought I would take a moment and ask that. And I'm not sure if you are scheduled to come back in tomorrow to talk about literacy, but we will need to hopefully get you or Mr. French or the appropriate team in to return to that issue with us. In the meantime, however, we do have miscellaneous education ideas before us. You may not have heard prior to the discussion on dyslexia, we mentioned that we will be constructing a miscellaneous education bill. There might be some things that we would put in that bill, possibly some work we're doing, as you may have heard, on libraries, some work on school wellness, as well as facilitating cultural liaisons, if appropriate. So what we thought we would do is have the two of you start the conversation with us today around your needs and what that possible vehicle for us might look like. So with that, Ms. Simmons and Mr. Filcher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Emily Simmons. I'm the Agency of Education's General Counsel. This is the first time I've had the pleasure to be with this committee in this biennium, so thanks for having me. Ted and I are going to walk through the document that we provided a little bit before you began today. I don't know if you've had time to access it from your documents page, but it is live. In that document, we're going to give you background and proposed language on 3 issues that all are, I'd say, lessons learned or needs identified through the state's COVID emergency response. They aren't tied necessarily to the ongoing response. That's why I refer to them as more lessons learned, things that we've identified that probably could be done more simply or better after having gone through this experience. So those, and we can hop around.
Sorry, can you hear me okay? Please know that we also, I know you're coming back, or Secretary French is coming in on Friday with perhaps some written testimony tomorrow, responding to some of our COVID response financial commitments that we're pushing down the hall into appropriations, as well as some other likely language. So know that these are some things that we are also talking about. Great.
Great. So we can probably weave all of those together. So the 3 issues that we're prepared to talk to you about today have to do with a uniform school calendar for the state, simplifications of the home study statutes, and then an addition of items about which supervisory unions could enter into agreements among one or more supervisory unions in order to facilitate student attendance outside of their home district. So the first one, if you're following along in our document, the first one we come to is a discussion, background information on school calendars and why we see a need for a statewide uniform school calendar. So as you may be aware, Vermont does have a statute on school calendars. It requires coordination among CTE regions. So it's not the status quo that every single school district pursues its individual school calendar. The statute does require superintendents and headmasters that belong to the same CTE region to coordinate each year and announce a common calendar prior to April 1st of each school year for the following school year. So we have 8 to 10 CTE regions. We can get you information about what those are that are working together now to establish calendars. But we see many places where districts or schools choose to deviate from that calendar. It does say that they're required to follow the same one in law, but it's not always the case. There are compelling needs why someone, or I assume there are compelling needs why someone might deviate from that. And we do see differences from one high school to another, and sometimes provide technical assistance reminding folks that you are supposed to be following a common calendar for a CTE region unless the agency has granted a waiver for a specific circumstance. So we noticed that in the context of our response to COVID-19, one of the barriers was common data about what schools were doing and their schedules. We developed a survey tool actually to collect information about school schedules for this year. And in response, the governor set, as you will remember, a uniform start date through an executive order across the state. One of the reasons to do that was to reduce the complexity around opening school and to bring coherence to the epidemiological data and response that would flow from that. It allowed us to get everyone on the same page to have a common start date. Had we not done that, different schools would have been following their previously established calendar back in April to start school at different times in different states of readiness. Another aspect that I'm sure legislators have experienced is when statewide data collection or statewide initiatives like lead testing was a good example of this, or called for, the various school calendars add a layer of complexity because there will be things that can't be undertaken when school is open or when school is not open. And the agency has to then seek information about who's in school which week and what's going on, as well as the sort of lack of coordination of teacher in-service days across the state. The professional development days for each supervisory unions are an important element of the school calendar. So all in all, the point here is that the agency feels adopting a uniform statewide school calendar, which we would seek to set only after consultation with the field, would generally reduce complexity and give us other positive advantages. So we have, on the second page of our testimony, marked up some language if you choose to consider this. The essential elements are that references to the state board are eliminated, that we propose the agency set the school calendar, that there be a requirement in the statute for consultation before announcing that school calendar. And as you can see in the markup of the language, just following that concept allows you to get rid of several provisions such as waiver and coordination that superintendents are otherwise doing locally.
So statewide school calendars have been proposed since Senator Chittenden's ancestors ruled the state, and it's yet to happen. So I just want to, as you know, it comes up a lot. Are you familiar with Senator Blaine of Bennington County, Ms. Simmons?
No.
That's because he lost election after putting in a bill that mandated a state calendar. I'm kidding, there's no Senator Blaine, but for some reason there always seems to be this real challenge around state calendars. So I just, I appreciate this. It's good to have. I appreciate your willingness to put it out there, and Committee, any specific questions related to the state calendar at this point before we move on to the next item? Please, Senator Lyons.
So my usual question is, will the calendar that you recommend include a school start date after Labor Day?
That's not a requirement that we've offered in the language. You could put that requirement on the agency developed calendar. That we would, under the language that we've proposed, we would pick a uniform start date. We haven't committed yet what day it would be. I think it might change from year to year depending on the calendar itself.
And I'll just note, I appreciate the your comments, Mr. Chair, in terms of that this has been an item that's been discussed before and has been a topic of significant debate. And we recognize that there are various opinions about starting before or after Labor Day or various other, that this is a conversation. And we would, the requirement in the draft language would be to have the secretary take advice from headmasters, superintendents, principals, school boards. So we're expecting still a lively exchange of views on the actual the actual start date itself and the calendar specifics, but proposing to put this in statewide. Really, in this context, we're bringing it up as my colleague mentioned, in the context of some recent experience that's demonstrated to us that it's very, very useful. And I actually meant to put a link into the study to our state guidance. I can provide that to the committee, but there was a real need this year to start at a certain time so that we could, so the health department could make some epidemiological observations with related to what step of the state guidance we were going to operate at. We were operating for much of the month of September at a more protective level of operation. That's the step 2 level, before moving to step 3, which is the current operating mode and has been since then. So we really wanted to make sure that was tightly coordinated. I really hope that we don't face similar circumstances again, but certainly having a unified school calendar would have a lot of positive follow-on effects. So that's why we're bringing this back to the fore as a policy initiative.
Thank you, Senator Hooker.
And that's a good segue into the question that I had, which was, should we, heaven forbid, still be in a state of emergency in the fall? Will schools be expected to start on the same day, or will they be able to go back to their schedule as it was before the pandemic?
I don't want to, I can't answer that because I don't want to speak for the governor, but the governor set the uniform school calendar or set the uniform start date this year under his executive authority under the state of emergency. If we are under a state of emergency come the end of August, that would be an option that he could consider under those emergency powers. It's not something that would exist if we are out of the state of emergency. And I think we're all hoping that emergency will come to an end.
Thank you.
Anything else on a school calendar before we move to home study? Okay, thank you.
Another lesson learned from our COVID response is that we had a huge increase, I'm sure that you've heard, in interest in home study. And home study, if you're not familiar, is one of the 3 ways that a family can fulfill Vermont's compulsory attendance requirements for students. So between the ages of 6 and 16, everyone who has control of a student those ages is required to cause the student to attend a public school, an independent school that is approved or recognized, or to enroll the student in a home study program. So it's an important aspect of our oversight of the well-being of children before you even get to education. So we saw over a 100% increase in home study applications this fall as a direct result of the state of emergency. The agency does not know, we don't have any forecasting about whether that increased interest will continue once the pandemic conditions have ended. It's possible that many families have discovered home study, it worked for them, and they would continue to use that method rather than the other options. Through the huge increase in enrollment, we noticed that our statute is perhaps overly complex, especially compared to our New England neighbors. Our current system has the Agency of Education acting as receiving and approving the elements of a home study application, things like the curriculum that will be taught, the adaptations for students with disabilities, and the end-of-year assessments all come to the agency and are actually evaluated for their quality and whether or not they meet our requirements. Most New England states have more of a notice enrollment paradigm where they receive notice and that's really it, other than telling the applicant your application is complete and you are legally enrolled in home study. They don't really have any more hands-on. Vermont, I sometimes wonder if there is clear understanding of what the Agency of Education's role is, because we don't have that clear notice enrollment. We have something a little more, but we do not have strong or comprehensive oversight of programs of home study once they're underway by any means. That really is delegated to the families. So we would propose to greatly simplify our home study regulations. I've sent specific language to Jen that was a little longer than I felt you would want in your written testimony, but essentially it's as I've outlined. A parent would send an application with basic demographic information and a set of assurances to the Agency of Education. Within a 10-day or 14-day window, we would communicate back to the family, you have met the minimum requirements, you are legally enrolled in home study, and our involvement would end there. There is still in our outline an agreement that the family makes to assess the student's educational progress and some allowed methods for those assessments. However, the assurance would only be that the assessment happens and that the parent has a record of the assessment that they will maintain. Those would not come to the state. Simplifying in this way would allow us to strike what's a current hearing process. Currently, the agency has a duty to maintain a list of outside attorneys who are hearing officers in case the agency needs to challenge an aspect of a proposed home study program and have a APA hearing to actually prohibit the enrollment from going forward. We do that only very rarely when we're concerned about the safety of the students primarily. The Department for Children and Families is also involved. An important aspect of our thinking on this is that the Department of Children and Families would continue to have a strong role in ensuring the well-being of students. It would just be this educational quality side that the agency would step back from a little bit.
I'm sorry. For some reason, I'm not sure why
You're
that's.
like Darth Vader.
Yeah, let me see if I turn it down. Is that better?
That is better.
Okay, yeah, because, okay. I do, Senator Chittenden's expressions let me know when I'm coming across in an odd way. Senator Hooker, please.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Simmons, the applications up 100% are for the fall. That's
Correct.
and what
this
does that
year.
mean in numbers of home study programs that are, or participants that are out there? What's it?
I don't have the number with me, but it was in the magnitude of hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay. And would you have, could you get us those numbers and how many students are affected by these programs?
Sure. I see Ted's taking a note of that. We've provided that information in a legislative update, so that'll be easy to access.
Okay. Thank you.
Get that to you.
Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry if you had this and I missed it, but under D on that, assessing the student's academic progress, can you just say how that differs from what you have now?
The types of accepted, sorry, I didn't know if you were finished.
I am now, yeah.
Sorry, the types of information are largely the same. We've taken out some detail to be more general in describing, for instance, a standardized assessment that may be administered by the school district. The main difference is that instead of submitting that information to the agency for evaluation by the agency, it it would simply take place, be recorded by the family and maintained by the family, and that would be the end of the requirement.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Senator Chinden.
So I'm the new guy, and I'm going to say that for a while. And when I'm seeing this as a potential miscellaneous bill compared to what I saw in DMV, the DMV miscellaneous bill, the changes I found to be very non-controversial without probably drawing a lot of attention. So that's why I thought they qualified. They were important changes, but I didn't expect a lot of noise. To the point about the academic calendar, what I'm seeing here, I feel like this is going to generate some noise. And I'm trying to overlay that with a miscellaneous bill, but maybe that's just too much of a new guy question. And I'm just wondering why this would be, these two would be bundled into what I understand the miscellaneous bills to be able to accomplish.
Yeah, no, it's a really very good question. I've been at, different committees have approached it different ways. I have also, to be honest, I thought we might hear more of a miscellaneous corrections in some ways bill today, where it's changing, updating language, updating statute a little bit. So yes, I agree that these are three bigger topics, and it certainly can be decided how we move them, or if honestly we move them at all. Prior to crossover, they all might need additional consideration. I still would like to do some kind of miscellaneous education bill to help. I think it would help the House out in their work, because it would allow them to add things that they're looking for something to move sort of, again, post crossover. So bottom line is we can configure it any way we want. And these may need to travel separately, given that they're big ticket items. And before we do compile a miscellaneous ed bill, I would have everybody vote on each thing to make sure that we have enough support to get it out of committee. So good question. Any other questions on this? It sounds like if in the most simplest form, there's less oversight of home study with these changes.
Correct. Less paperwork for sure.
Mm-hmm. But would you also say less paperwork would mean less oversight in terms of, if the elevator speech to constituents would be, we are going to know less about students' academic accomplishments if they're participating in home study?
Yes, we would collect less information. The interesting fact about our current system, to me, maybe you won't find it interesting, is that the agency collects a lot of information and has very little authority to influence the outcomes for students in home study. So it is, you could say, burdensome on families. There is all of the staff time at the agency to process that paperwork, and the outcomes wouldn't necessarily be markedly different, because the current statute does not empower the agency to approve or deny elements of what a family plans to do in home study. It requires us to know a lot about them in order to say, yes, you've submitted everything, and you've the requirements are very detailed in what must be submitted. But for instance, when you would have to send us a math curriculum, for instance, there's no authority for the agency to say this is not rigorous enough for this grade level for the subject of math.
Okay. Yes, Senator Hooker.
That kind of begs the question, what happens when the kids go back to school? I mean, are they tested to see what grade level they're at? Are they assessed? How do they reintegrate into the public school system?
Right, they are assessed. The method of assessment will depend on the school district's procedures, and it might not be a formal test. It might be a assessment with a classroom teacher to see the student's level of progress. And the parent would have the home study information, all of these assessments, for instance, that we call for in our language, to also give to the school that might be helpful in assessing the student.
Okay. Moving on.
Then the last is, I would say, simpler than the other two, in my opinion, at least. During the COVID response, it was in March and April when we saw, schools shut down and then starting to talk about how they would reopen. Supervisory unions immediately began to ask the agency, how should we respond to these requests from families? Many of them were staff members, but all families who are seeking special permission to enroll in a school that better suits their needs. Are we even allowed to do that? There was a lot, when I was speaking to superintendents about this, there was a lot of interest in allowing flexibility to students where there was capacity in a school district to allow students to come in. And we urged them to use, of course, non-discriminatory means that were cognizant of making sure they were delivering special education, and encouraged them to enter into agreements with one another to facilitate students moving. So a student would be a resident and legally entitled to attend in one district. Their district could enter into an agreement with the place they'd like to attend instead to allow that one-for-one swap almost. It's arguable that doing so is allowed under current law, but there are a lot of questions that come along with that we thought could be clarified by a little amendment to statute. So there's an existing section of statute that covers joint agreements among supervisory unions. We're proposing we'd hope that it'd be a very clear paragraph that outlines, in addition to what it's already allowed, if they choose, it's not a requirement, that two or more supervisory unions could enter into an agreement to allow a non-resident student to enroll in a school operated, or in cases, think about remote learning in a class, might not be a physical enrollment in school, operated by the non-resident district. We add in here that at minimum, the process needs to not be discriminatory. We're thinking a first come, first serve or other fair method, and that the SUs need to be mindful of special education responsibilities and costs. There's several ways that those obligations can be upheld. And finally, that they need to talk about whether tuition will be paid or not. There's a provision that I think it's important to exclude. There's a provision in our tuition statutes which requires a district, if it's going to receive a public school district, if it's going to receive tuition from a non-operating district, that it charge the same tuition to every non-operating district students. That's important, but we don't think it needs to apply in this case when two supervisory unions are working together to facilitate enrollment.
So, Ms. Simmons, give us an example of when this would be needed.
Oh, I thought you were going to pitch me an example. I'm sorry, I've got a few. So currently, different schools, as you know, have different remote and in-person days.
Yeah.
If a parent who lives in one district but works outside of the district has a different schedule than their students at home, that's going to obviously create a lot of problems. It might be in the interest of the SUs to even extend as a benefit of employment to their staff that you can enroll your own students, even if you don't live in the district where you work, for instance. So the non-discriminatory basis, for instance, might be students of staff may enroll at no cost.
Senator Pershler.
Thinking about.
I'd want to go, or?
Please. Senator Pershler.
Okay. Thanks for bringing this up, because I had several teachers of constituents of mine that had this very problem last year, that they wanted to bring their child with them to where they work because of the hybrid nature of learning. They didn't line up between the two, and some superintendents allowed it and some did not. which made it more frustrating. So one of my questions is, given that some superintendents are already doing it, how did you come along with this recommendation of the statute change? Since they're already doing it, my understanding was they were doing it legally. It was just based on what they wanted to do. Does that question make sense, or is it too confusing?
Totally. So the most clear question about legality for the current practice is this provision 824B2, which does very clearly say you, as a public district, you must offer identical tuition terms to all districts. So some superintendents totally justifiably were not comfortable entering into those agreements because they were very wary of acting contrary to law, and might have had some students attending on a tuition basis and then weren't comfortable saying that other students could attend for free because that would be a conflict with 824. Others, I think, were understandably overwhelmed and didn't see a clear path to do this. It wasn't written that you may do this. It was just people saying, I think this is allowed if I look at the statutes in context. So I think it was also a lack of understanding.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
And so is the current statute say that a school cannot take tuition students as well as have a set number of students that they accept, like on a lottery basis? Then, you know, what your language has, this non-discriminatory basis. Because that's what it seemed like you just said, that they couldn't get tuition for some and do free for others. But are you saying they can do it as long as those that are getting it free is non-discriminatory?
Saying there's an argument to be made that they can't do it. Now, this is outside of the Public High School Choice Law Act 129, which is a very defined program of a certain number of slots and a lottery. It's very clear. Setting that number of slots aside, it is unclear. I mean, we at the agency have not taken enforcement action. We don't even have any enforcement action against people who did this, but I'm not comfortable coming down on one side or the other because 824 does say to offer identical terms. And I can see the argument that free attendance is a term that's different than a tuition-based cost of attendance.
Okay, thank you. I forgot that the high school choice program of the lotteries is a separate thing. So thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you both for coming in. Appreciate all this information. We will certainly have a committee discussion around these issues as we're crafting what will likely end up being some kind of miscellaneous education bill. And thank you, Mr. Fisher, for jumping in on the literacy question. If you would be so kind as to, at some point, actually sooner rather than later, I suspect, I'm hoping this will be easy for you to find, would you share with the committee the org chart for the Agency of Education so that we have a sense of sort of, you know, I serve on natural resource and the energy in the morning. And so just to give us a sense of, you know, how many folks are working on this, how many folks do we have on that? As we look to this literacy bill, I think that would be helpful. And as you know, we're also jumping into 2 other topics, and I think that would be relevant to some of these conversations.
I'd be absolutely willing to do so. I will send along a copy of our public-facing org chart, which we have on our website, with the caveat that it hasn't been updated in a year because I'm the one who updates it, and we've been doing COVID stuff.
Absolutely.
But many of the names have changed, but the positions are relatively the same. Some of them may be under the hiring freeze. Okay. We can also run an updated org chart for you in the near future and get that over to you, but it'll give you the general sense at the very least.
Okay, really appreciate that. Ms. Simmons, it's great to be working with you again.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, you too. Okay. We are now shifting to our final topic. We have asked and Jeannie I don't see Mr. Giles. I saw Marilyn, Ms. Cargill there.
Yeah, I guess they left. I'll have to email them and tell them they're up.
Okay, why don't you tell them, why don't we just take a 5-minute stretch, and if you just ask them to come back, that would be great. So committee, we have, to bring us back to our letter to appropriations, which hopefully everybody will feel good about getting out this Friday. One of the issues that we are looking at has to do with access to higher education. And we have language in there that VSAC knows about that appropriates at this point $1 million to provide a free class this summer or fall to any Vermont State College or high schools for high school seniors and any Vermont resident who is seeking to transition to a new career or enhance their workforce or academic skills. I mentioned to Ms. Cargill, I mentioned to your colleague, Mr. Giles, this morning that this is not money for the big bill. This is not the budget, the big budget. These are expedited funds. These are funds that appropriations and education feel should get out quickly, if you will. They are priorities, improving literacy, making certain that students have access to robust summer programs, and also making certain that students have access this summer to higher education opportunities. So this in no way is, should not be seen as not taking some of your priorities seriously. This is just the expedited federal dollars. And I would suspect, as I'm sure you are tracking well, that not only will there be the budget bill, but also additional federal dollars for education that will need to be distributed. So with that, I think one of the things we are asking ourselves, we put in $1 million almost as a placeholder, or I put in, I don't want to blame the committee for that, just as a way to start to have a conversation. We know that the McClure Foundation spent roughly $700,000 when they opened up CCV to all seniors graduating last year. We also, I think I know the Appropriations Committee, and I believe our committee also recognizes the importance of location, geographic location. In other words, in some communities, Bennington being one of them, if you're going to go to class in person, driving to Castleton and our nearest state college might not work, but CCV would. And if you're in Johnson, Johnson might, or Northern Vermont University might work better for you than I think the other CCV up there that might be closest is Morrisville. So even though they're not terribly far apart. So flexibility, and also it will it will support the work of our state colleges. And the reason this is in the expedited bill is similar to summer opportunity programs. There is, we want people to be able to plan. We want not only students and their families to be able to say that their son or daughter or they themselves are going to take a class this summer, but it also allows for the institutions to plan that they may have additional, they may want to do additional offerings or may need certain faculty members. So with that, I'm hoping you might weigh in a little bit on that dollar amount, as well as talk about anything else that is of interest to you related to scholarship.
Well, let me try to keep it tightly focused on your question. So when we look at $1 million,
yeah.
If you have students attending CCV is about $280 a credit. Mm-hmm. So, and most of their courses, although not all, are 3-credit courses. So $1 million is going to fund roughly 1,200 students, not quite, that would want to take one course. And I think that's what this is about, right? Is a single class that you're trying to pay for either during the summer or the fall.
I think at this point, there's also been no committee discussion about increasing that to 2 or 3 classes. So again, that we know that's a low number that we have there, but any direction you can give us would be appreciated.
Yeah, so again, if you open that up a little bit, so if we start at 1,200 at CCV, taking a single course, that's the most that you're going to be able to do with $1 million. If you change that to they could take 2 or 3 courses, you just start dividing, right? If they can take 2 courses, it's 600. If they can take 3, and you can do that math very, very easily. The other thing, when I look at Castleton, Northern Vermont University, they're very close per credit hour in cost. They are not quite, but almost twice as expensive as CCV. Vermont Technical College has a number of different programs, all with different prices. So they're a little more difficult to talk about, but they tend to be around $600 for just their VTC standard. If we stay away from dental hygiene and nursing and LPN and aviation and paramedic and all the other things that they offer, all the other wonderful programs that they have. So, again, your outside edge is that 1,200 students, and then you just work your way backwards for any of these other programs. And once you start mixing and matching, right, because you want them to pick the school that has the program that they're interested in, and you want them to pick the school that's most convenient to where they live. So I think realistically, you're going to get some mixture of students at all institutions, and you're going to get a mixture of students in different locations. What we have found, this is just our own experience. So we offer the advancement grant, which we spoke to you folks about. It might have been last week, but I can't remember exactly when we spoke to you. It might have been 2 weeks ago now. That program is open to any student who wants to take a non-degree course at any of our Vermont colleges, as well as our training programs. We find, without any comparison whatsoever, that CCV is the school of choice for students that want to take a single class. Or even if they want to take 1 or 2 courses, adult students tend to lean heavily into the CCV programs, I think in part for some of the convenience that we talked about of location. So I think you could probably expect that you would see something similar. The majority of students that are doing this will look at those CCV courses first. But if you wanted to say, well, we need to come up with a different average, I would suggest that you start assuming that if you put everyone together, it's going to be about $400 a credit, and that'll kind of balance out your really low CCV with your slightly higher VTC students. And
so I should also mention it. So first of all, that's really helpful in reminding us that CCV could be a spot. The reason we're thinking about increasing it to 2 to 3 classes, number one, it's quite possible that we have the resources to do that in these expedited funds, and if not now, at least it would be on people's radar for additional federal funding if that were to come in. And we felt as though, all right, so if you're going to jump into something, this would be it would kind of, if you've got 3 classes under your belt or 2, you have a sense of what it all might be like going to college, carrying 2 or 3 classes. And if that goes well, you might be even more invested to continue. The other piece that we're talking about is, and this is another important part for you to weigh in on, and I apologize, I didn't preface your introduction with this, was, should we be limiting it to, household incomes of $100,000 or less in terms of access to these kinds of offerings? We know that, we know that you've all talked about $50,000 or less. We feel that does capture a certain segment of the population. Those students perhaps can be considered our most neediest financially in the state, would also be eligible for Pell Grants. This opens it up a little bit for those families that parents might have debt, that they're still paying off, they're being cautious, they have a mortgage. Really, it's not easy going, if you will. Family might not have a lot of savings. This might bring in those additional families. The keeping it open, the McClure Foundation, I think, would say, in fact, I know that they would say, because they sent me an email about it this morning, it's smooth, it's simple, it allows all the institutions, lack of paperwork, all those kinds of things. And it's not as though, and then what we would need to do is also just make certain that those that might feel intimidated by that college experience, how do we reach out and make sure we capture those students, so it's not just, middle and upper middle class family households that are taking advantage of this. Is that helpful?
It is. So let me just say, truly what you're describing right now is the advancement grant.
Yeah.
That was exactly the program that this body created back in 1982. And it was so that students could take training programs, but also the other key component of this was to allow families to experience college that weren't ready to take that leap into applying for admission, so that they could take a handful of college level courses to prove mostly to themselves that they could do that level of work without assuming any risk. So they weren't borrowing money for it. They weren't applying for admission. They were just applying for an advancement grant. Students can receive up to 6 advancement grants in a lifetime. So there's your multiple number of courses that students can take in order to attend a college. And it does all of the things that you're talking about. It's going to allow a student to experience college. It's going to allow that student to feel that they have a proven track record of being able to successfully complete schoolwork. I'm trying to remember what our number is, but we run a report, and I want to go back and get some numbers for you that tell us, we run this every couple of years, but what % of students who start in advancement grants in non-degree programs go on to further education. And that's actually a pretty high number. This is a very successful program for getting people through training and or into higher education. So I think the direction that you're going in is right. I completely agree with the McClure Foundation that the simpler your message is, the easier it is for families to take advantage of and not worry that there's some fine print that they're missing. The one thing I will say, so when I just ran the numbers, if we used $400, all of a sudden we're down to about 800 students that we could help that were taking 3 credit courses.
Yeah.
And even if you had extra money in the pool that you were willing for them to use, that's probably the number that you're talking about. If you open it up to everyone, which is certainly the cleanest and easiest message, then yeah, you're going to have families of means. You're going to have families in upper income and upper middle incomes whose children take these classes for free. And you may still struggle to get low income families to be able to do this, because what we found, and we found this with the dual enrollment courses, and we've talked about those when I met with you folks, even though the dual enrollment voucher makes the dual enrollment course free for a high school student, for low income families, books, fees, transportation, and now if we start talking about multiple courses, maybe meals while they're on campus, those expenses turned out to be insurmountable for some low income families. So I don't know that if you want to take that into consideration in any way when you think about this funding, but if it's the single course, then probably you're not worrying about food, because most single courses are a matter of an hour or so. So that probably doesn't become an issue for you. But books and transportation, depending on whether they're going to the campus to take these programs, still could be a barrier for low-income families. And those, I think, are just all things you guys need to think about.
Sure. Does the advancement grant, that's an actual fund, correct?
So what we do is Every year,
And by that, I mean, is it an endowed fund?
no, the advancement grant is an appropriated, it's when we get the $19.978 million a year, we divide that between full-time, part-time, and advancement grants. This year, we had $2.4 million in the advancement grant program. And that's the one we're asking for the additional $500,000 for. But it's state appropriated money that runs the advancement grant. It's not private money.
Okay. And those dollars aren't carried over year to year.
They are our
Let
appropriation.
me rephrase my question. And the reason it's important is because the federal dollars have to be spent a certain way. Is it an established fund that in any way, it doesn't have to be private dollars, but is it an established fund that you're taking interest off of, or is it just an established fund that, taking, investment dollars off of, or is it just an established fund that you just take the appropriation out of, and if there are dollars left there, there's just going to be more in the fund the following year?
So, Senator Campion, I may want you to actually talk to Scott to make sure I'm not misstating this.
Sure.
When we get that appropriation, 100% of the funding that VSAC receives goes out in the form of those scholarships and those those grants. We do have in our statute, we have permission that unspent dollars roll into the following year. So we can use those in the next year. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm sorry, I didn't ask it really clearly. I just want to make sure, and I'll ask Jim to flag this also for us when we talk to Joint Fiscal and others. There was some question around whether or not we can give some monies to fund, certain kinds of funds. And I might be slicing this the wrong way and it might not even be important, but a lot of this is getting dollars right out, and holding dollars over maybe for a year might be okay. Maybe more than that might not, but I just want to understand that a little bit better. That's all.
Certainly.
Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. The advancement grants, are those targeted by income at all, or just that it's for one class? And
no, so the advancement grant, all of VSAC's grant programs are need-based. So the advancement grant was designed to be a very quick turnaround time. So people are not filling out FAFSAs, if you're familiar with that form. They are filling out an online application that we turn around in 10 days. And that does collect income information and family size information, and it is based on financial need. If you wanted to run a program that's not based on financial need, I mean, that's certainly something that can be done. That's not, I don't think, a particularly heavy lift, but it would be a little bit different from what we currently run with the advancement grant that we run today.
So as need-based, the advancement grant changes from 100% to some other percentage based on the families.
Right. So if you have a full need family who applies for an advancement grant, they would receive the full cost of tuition at CCV for a single course. They would receive the full cost of tuition at Linden or Johnson or Castleton for a course. If they were at VTC, I'm trying to remember what our maximum college grant is, and I don't have it on the top of my head, and I apologize. And in our training programs, the legislature set the maximum at $3,000. So if you take a program that costs $2,400 and your full need, we will fund all of the tuition. If you're looking at a CDL license that's $10,000, we fund the first $3,000 of it.
So Ms. Cargill, if we were to give, I'm sorry, Senator Perchlik, did you have a follow-up? Okay. So if we were to direct these funds to VSAC to administer, put it in advancement funds, grants, you would be able to, again, distribute it by the way that you talked about to CCV, state colleges, or Vermont Tech, depending on what students want and need.
Right. Yes, I believe we would. I don't think that that's a problem.
Okay.
It just would have to be a slightly different eligibility criteria because, again, as I mentioned, advancement grant has a full application and a needs analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm hearing, at least described now, not that it couldn't change, but what I'm hearing described now is that you would like to pick an income cutoff. It could be 100,000, it could be 125, it could be there is no cutoff at all. And anyone who wants this, as long as there's funding, would be awarded. So depending on how you choose to set that up, that might have to be a slightly different program, but we would use the same mechanism that we already have for awarding, verifying enrollment, and dispersing funds to the institution.
Mr. Desmarais.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just put in the chat the statute that governs the advancement grants.
Oh, thank you.
So it's not as Marilyn mentioned, it's not a separate fund. It's basically a program that money is appropriate to every year.
Okay. Well, you know, we need to be putting, it's not as though this committee and appropriations would be distributing these, you know, taking applications all summer. So we need somewhere to put it. So this is very, very helpful as an option. Senator Hooker.
I guess my question to Ms. Cargill is, you know, what is the uptake of these grants? You talked about if there's money left, you can roll it over. Does that happen frequently? Do you expend all the money? Can you use, you know, obviously you could use more, but with maybe 1,200 more grant applications coming in.
So I think what we discovered, all of us, when the McClure Foundation gave the gift of a free course to every high school graduating senior at CCV, they had a tremendous uptake in that. And it was such a clear, clean message of what they were offering that students really took advantage of it, which I think was exactly what McClure and CCV was looking for. So one, to your question, do I think students will take advantage of this? I think they will in the same way that they did of the McClure funding. We've made it, already we're making the offer a little more complex because in a really good way, because you can take this money to any of the state colleges, right? So it's not just CCV, you could take it to Johnson and Linden. The other thing I believed that McClure did was even if the student was attending that school in the fall semester, they allowed their scholarship to act as a scholarship against that student's bill. And I'm assuming that you would do the same thing and that's something it's not written in your paragraph, but if somebody was a Johnson student, they have applied to Johnson for admission, they've been admitted, and they're going in the fall semester, would you allow these funds to be a scholarship towards that? Or are you only interested in funding them if they're using that non-degree path to explore higher education?
Yeah, I think that's a committee, it's a good question.
To your other questions.
I think in committee, I don't know what, we'll have to return to this, but one of our decision points is going to have to be, do we limit this or do we open it up to everybody? And I certainly see both sides of this, but in terms of marketing it and getting it out there, and that's one of the reasons we want to do this with the expedited money, is to give people time. I just don't want the kids sitting at home thinking that because his or her parents are both making $45,000, they might not qualify. There's something about it being open to everyone that I really like, and people seeing it in their paper, seeing it online. People have their own unique circumstances now more than ever. I mean, on paper, the family may have, look okay, that, and there's something about opening it up to all Vermonters that I feel is really appealing to me, but that's something we'll have to return to. And I'm sorry, Ms. Cargill, I interrupted you. Senator Hooker's second question.
Right. The only thing I wanted to respond to Senator Hooker, she asked if we usually use all of these funds.
Right.
We run out of advancement grant funding almost every year. In 20 was one of the very first years that we didn't, and that had to do with the pandemic. But as a regular rule of thumb, sometime between December and early March, we expend all the funding for that program, which is one of the reasons we were asking for a $500,000 increase in advancement grant funding.
And if I can just
Please.
follow that up, when you do run out, I mean, do you have applications that come in and you have to refuse the grants? Are these kind of rolling applications? How does that work? So like once you're out of the money, obviously you can't accommodate the applicant, but is that, you know, this is when they're due and we'll take the first however many grants you can accommodate?
No, we actually use what we refer to as a projection model, where we're trying to project how far into the year we're going to be able to fund. We're trying to get well into the spring semester because, as you know, adult students make late decisions, right? They're not deciding this March that they'll be in school in September, and they're not deciding in July or August that they're going to start school in January. So we're purposely trying to run programs that will go into the spring term so that adult students can take advantage of them. What we do is when we start to run out of funds, we'll begin to let training programs know. We'll let our outreach counselors who work with adult students know. We'll let the colleges know that we are running low on non-degree grant funding. And then as soon as we're out of funds, we notify all of those groups. And that usually, it doesn't stop applications completely, but it's really fast after that because there's a lot of communication between most adults who are looking for either training or education beyond high school and a college. They will ask if there's assistance. And as soon as they know there's not, they're not applying. They're waiting until July 1 when funding becomes available again.
Ms. Cargill, will you remind us, how much did you give out last year, the dollar amount? Roughly.
Yeah, I'm going to say 2.4 million is the amount that we had in the program. And I don't think we spent 100% of it last year with COVID, but every year before that, with the exception maybe of one since 1982, we have spent all the funds in this program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, we have some decisions to make, and I'm going to work with Mr. Desmarais after this, hopefully. I actually have a 5 o'clock, but and get a new draft updated for the committee. But it sounds like, committee, that at least a starting point would be to, and I'll talk to Senator Kitchell about this, but significantly increase that $500,000 amount, that $1 million amount, and direct it to this VSAC program so that so they can be the distributors of these dollars. I mean, unless somebody has something else out there, but it sounds like they can do the work that we're hoping to have done. Senator Hooker.
Well, the only question I have then is whether, you know, can it be opened up to everyone, and will you still administer it if it's open to everyone?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously I really need Scott in this conversation with me, but we have a number of programs that we run that aren't need-based. So the National Guard Scholarship Tuition Benefit Program is not need-based. Mm-hmm. The Nursing Scholarship Program is not need-based. We need nurses way more than we need to direct funding. We just need nurses that want to work in Vermont. So we have other programs that do not have a need component to them. So I think that that's probably, you know, not a concern to us. As I said, I just want to make sure that I've got Scott in this conversation. And I mentioned to Senator Campion before we started, and I'm sorry I didn't tell the rest of you, Scott very much wants to be in this conversation. His internet has crashed, and he's been texting me about every 10 minutes to say he cannot get it back up again, and Comcast has not shown up yet. So I apologize to all of you that he's not on this call.
If you wouldn't mind looping back to him this evening and just getting an answer to that question, whether or not you'd be able to do that if we were to open it up. Also, would you allow students to take multiple classes? You could get
Right.
back on those two, that'd be great.
Yeah, once you tell us what you want to do.
Well, we're leaning toward those two things, and I think it really would just depend in part on, your response to it. I hate to end this. Any other pressing questions? I'm afraid I have a 5 o'clock that. Okay. Ms. Cargill, thank you. We'll look forward to, if you don't mind, we're getting tight here on time. We would love to get a letter out by Friday. If you do have the opportunity to email me and Ms. Lowell later this evening, if you can reach Scott, that would be great, and we can get that to the committee. I will work with Mr. Desmarais this evening to get, after I get the information from Ms. Cargill, and just continue to produce another draft. I'm also going to share an early draft with Senator Kitchell, just to make sure also that she is kept up to date around what she is seeing and what we might end up asking for in case she has any concerns or pushback now. Better to know before we send it. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you all. Ms. Cargill, great to have you. Really appreciate it. Very informative. Dare I say better than what Scott could do?
No, don't say that.
Thank you so much. Really great having you. And Jim, if you don't mind staying on for a minute, that would be great.